Today's episode is brought to you by Media for All, which was set up to help encourage more Black, Asian, and other ethnic talent into media, and to provide a support and mentoring network to ensure talent flourishes in the media industry that we all love. If you're looking for a mentor or would like to mentor young ethnic talent, check them out at mediaforall.org.uk, and it is all 100% free.
Hello and welcome to the Shiny New Object podcast. My name is Tom Ollerton. I'm the founder of Automated Creative, and this is a podcast about the future of marketing. Every week, I have the pleasure and the privilege of interviewing one of this industry's leaders. I'm on a call with Maya Barkay, who is Global Marketing Executive at Amdocs. Maya, thanks so much for joining the show. Could you give the audience an overview of who you are and what you do?
Sure. First of all, Tom, thanks for having me. So as Tom said, I'm Maya Barkay. Currently, I lead the marketing for the APAC division at Amdocs. For those who are not familiar with Amdocs, it's basically a software and services company that's been around for almost 40 years, servicing 350 providers in 80 countries. And basically, we provide software and services for the media and telecom space. My background kind of spans the marketing spectrum. So I've been at very large companies like Amdocs, spent some time at startups as well. So that has given me kind of a broad-based perspective and has made me more nimble, I guess, and adaptive. Started my career more in the Marcom space. So, and on the agency side. So spent a couple of years kind of getting my feet wet, getting beat up a little bit in some of these agency environments, and then moved to the client side to fintech and payments, financial services, and now kind of broader-based software and solutions.
So lots of exciting things in there. What do you mean by getting beat up? I'm assuming you don't mean that literally.
Well, you run an agency, so you know this, right? But kind of, and I'll get to this kind of example when I talk a little bit about some of my other experiences. But fresh faced out of school, you kind of have to make a decision. So actually, by the way, before, I'll backpedal a little bit. So how did I get into marketing, by the way? So I studied psychology and actually had a really, really strong affinity for psychology and thought I was going to get into clinical psych, and spent a lot of time in different clinical environments in school. But after a while, I did some externships, et cetera, and I was exposed to some of these clinical settings, and I realized that wasn't necessarily the right path for me to take. And then I kind of decided to kind of embark on the psychology of business, or business of psychology, if you will. And that's how I ended up in marketing. And then again, fresh faced out of school, and by the way, I'd moved to Tinseltown, being a fresh faced New Yorker, and making the sore mistake of moving to Los Angeles to spearhead my career. So I had to kind of try to find the different opportunities and get the greatest exposure to better understand, what verticals I wanted to get into and how I was going to best get exposed to the different facets of marketing. And so I went to the global firms and ended up part of the WPP group, if you're familiar with that. That's they have advertising agencies, and I ended up at Hill & Knowlton, which is a global PR agency. And that's also an interesting story, by the way, how I ended up with my first boss by choosing a book. I chose his
tell me
favorite
that story.
book.
That sounds great. Yeah.
So this, I don't know if I would recommend this to the audience that's listening. It ended up being kind of stream of consciousness, but basically all the undergraduates ended up being interviewed kind of along the same lines, like your CVs were aligned with the managing directors. Basically, you had a profile that was built on you, and you had to go and interview with several different managing directors, each one responsible for a different vertical domain. I ended up with the MD. I ended up being interviewed by the MD, who was responsible for the then new media and technology vertical. By the way, this is how I fell in love with technology, and ended up doing a lot kind of in the technology space of marketing. But new media, AKA the internet, what a concept. That was right precursor to the internet boom, to the .com boom. And we ended up just having a conversation. And one of the questions that he asked was, what's your favorite book? Seemingly innocuous question. And I, though I had, been very well trained in the interviewing process, that's what they do at school, right? They school you in that. I unexpectedly, what came out of my mouth, and I don't know if you're familiar with this author, was Portnoy's Complaint. I don't know if you're familiar with Philip Roth. He's let's just say this. He is kind of the analogous author. He's the written author to Woody Allen's screen prowess, right? He would be kind of his evil twin on the writing side. So you can only imagine what some of the some of the framings and some of the context and the content in that book kind of pervaded throughout. And I didn't realize what I basically was just talking about his prose and his style and his authenticity in in how he did his in how he wrote basically. And he ended up, so the MD I think was somewhat taken aback, but he ended up telling me that that was one of the propellants that ended up getting me the job, because I was, and this kind of leads to something else. I was unafraid, unbeknownst to myself, I was unafraid to, I guess, be very open and transparent, and very honest about perhaps a style of writing, or in this case, a style of writing that was perhaps unconventional and probably was not a politically correct book to introduce. It was not a Dostoevsky or Charles Dickens to introduce, while you're trying to make that polished first impression at a first interview. And that's actually what ended up impressing him. I mean, he said that amongst other things, but he said that was a real propellant. So that, to me was one of the first unexpected surprises kind of in this career path and journey. And it ended up being, what's interesting, it ended up being a very good fit and a very good kind of initial step and foundational kind of schooling for me to be in that type of environment. I think that's what you asked originally, the agency life, right? You get exposed to kind of all facets of the business. You get exposed to what it means to kind of service the client, and what it means to be, and kind of, it's the epitome of multitasking and juggling, what it means to be kind of an intense work environment, what it means to be in a very kind of, in many ways, kind of strict and stiff hierarchical environment where sometimes things aren't, in quotation marks, fair, and where you are asked to do things that are perhaps you think might be beneath you. I mean, this first role was half admin and half account work. And that was a tough act to swallow after kind of being in kind of an Ivy League school environment and having these fancy internships. But that was part of the important schooling that kind of allowed me to, like I said, get more than my feet wet, kind of in this initial stage of my career journey.
So I like that story about you choosing an odd book to help you get a job. So you got lucky there, you landed on your feet.
Yes.
So tell me about a work disaster, a real red-faced facepalm moment where you're like, but actually you're so glad that it happened. Where did it really go wrong that you're glad it did ultimately? Because things turned out
by
right.
The way, ironically, it's with this same manager, right? And at that same kind of incipient stage of my career. So by the way, it's good that I got all those screw ups, hopefully done at these initial stages. But it was, again, kind of an unexpected but very turnkey moment in my career that kind of really, this time it ended up being kind of something a bit more conscious that I did. And this was after a few months with the same MD. And like I said, I mean, the dynamic was very good. We worked very, very well together. And so there was already, I was already kind of establishing myself as someone who, could diligently kind of was up to task, okay, so to speak, still kind of proving myself, of course, but definitely kind of working up to par in terms of expectations. And this seems like, again, this really kind of insignificant moment, but one morning, I come into the office, and there are a couple people in his office, and I'm walking in. We're about to talk about the tasks of the day. And he puts, like, I don't know, 4 to 5 coins on his desk. And he says to me, do you mind getting me a cup of coffee? And this has happened before, right? So I said, probably I'd been at this role for maybe 6 months, I would say. And it happened before, and I'd ignored my instincts, and I just, sucked it up, so to speak, right? It was still the era, I guess, where we kind of had to suck it up, not, dissimilar, I think, to what perhaps some millennials experience, in this day and age. But I sucked it up. I sound like I was in the 40s. It wasn't the 40s, but it was a bit different then. And but this time something else, I mean, something was triggered, perhaps. And so I basically waited for I basically said, his name was Brian. Brian, do you mind can I talk to you for a sec? And I think he could tell that I was serious. So, for those who know me and have known me for extended period of time, I'm transparent when I want to be. I can definitely, play the diplomatic game when necessary, but when I choose to be transparent, I definitively am. And this was one of these moments. And so I waited till they left the room, but I said, can I talk to you for a second? And this was a moment of, if you look at objectively the situation, this was totally a moment of insubordinance. But what I said is, listen, Brian, and remember, this is a managing director. I'm fresh out of school. I said, I just want to be, I have to get something off my chest. I know that I'm in a role where you are, I don't remember exactly how I phrase it, right? Where there are clearly hierarchies here. You're clearly a lot more senior than I am. I know this role is partially admin, but and I actually don't mind even getting you a cup of coffee if you're incredibly busy and you're swamped and I'm going down to get it myself. But I would really prefer if you didn't, on your own volition, ask me to go and bring you your own cup of coffee, if you have the wherewithal and if you have the time to do it yourself, because I'm incredibly busy as well. And he looks at me and he said, fine, done. He takes back his coins and he never asked me to do it again. Now, it seems like a seemingly insignificant kind of exchange. But first of all, what that taught me, obviously, is, and like I said, it was a really turnkey moment, right? That sometimes you need to, so I'm going to talk a little bit about risks later, okay? But sometimes you need to take the types of risks that don't have to mean moving across to the other side of the world. Sometimes you need to kind of trust yourself, trust your instincts, and trust your own kind of, and think about your own kind of boundary setting, okay? And you need to take these types of, I don't know if to call them emotional risks, professional risks. Sometimes they'll backfire, but a lot of times they won't, right? And we'll get to that later when we get to the shiny new object. But this was a really kind of critical juncture. And I think, and I'll be honest, that from then on, there was a perception change and a perceptual shift in how he perceived me. And I honestly believe that, and there were many small types of exchange, similar types of exchanges where kind of boundary setting was critical, and where this type of risk taking of kind of standing your ground for something that you think is kind of it's a different kind of red line. Okay. People usually talk about red lines in different ways, but it's about taking the types of risks where you in your own gut and instinct believe that this is a line that should be drawn, then go ahead and take that risk. And like I said, sometimes it'll backfire, but many times it won't, because it is kind of, it will kind of help kind of build that inner kind of confidence and that inner kind of compass that will kind of help drive you to kind of really, striving for your best and kind of staying focused and on track with what you need to do. So that was kind of an interesting, others would have others said that was completely insubordinate. How could you do that? He's a very, he's a big, fancy MD. I mean, we at our levels don't do that, but it ended up not backfiring. So I think officially it would have been considered a screw up, but it ended up not being. So that was kind of an interesting exchange, interesting experience.
That is an interesting story that's got my brain running off in all kinds of different directions. First of all, I think I would have done that very differently. I think I would have definitely got the coffee and then put it on his desk and said, I'm really sorry that your legs are broken, or, like this, you're glued your chairs. I might have definitely made a bad joke out of it, which is kind of the way I
passive aggressive, right? The passive aggressive kind of, I think.
Or just massive aggressive. Anyway, you know,
massive aggressive.
But I remember in my first job in digital, working for a guy called Damien Kimmelman, who set up a company called Due Deal, hugely successful entrepreneur. And I gave that guy a hell of a time, man. And he had to take me aside a few times and said, Tom, you can't speak to me like that in front of people. But I think he sort of respected me for the same reason.
Right.
If you stand up to authority in a polite and logical
respectful
and or a humorous way, and you can get away with it, then get away with it. But then equally, I think both of our approaches could also be considered to be very wrong, because what you could have done is just got the coffee and then delivered an amazing bit of work and then said, look, there's your amazing bit of work. It would have been even better if I had to buy you coffee throughout the whole experience. You know, like there's a bunch of different ways. I'm curious to know if you think that was a worthwhile risk. Yes, it was a turnkey moment and it changed things, but what advice would you give to a student in that situation who didn't have the kind of personalities that we have, and maybe a bit more?
So by the way, that is key. So, you know, throughout my career, I've you know, and this is kind of tied to a different question, but I've really been able to kind of trust kind of my inner compass based on the relationships that I've developed with both peers, you know, employees, and of course my superior, so to speak. And only when I'm in that place where I feel comfortable and confident enough that I've established some sort of precedent, or that I've established the credibility to be able to kind of be bold-faced, or more so than I would, that's when I do, right? You know, when you're green and when you're starting, you know, a new role, or, you know, potentially at a new company, you need to build that credibility and trust first and foremost. And it takes time, right? Depending on the environment, depending on the context. You have to earn it, right? In whatever context that you're in, you completely have to earn that trust and respect and credibility. And it takes time. So I wouldn't be so bold-faced without it. Definitely not.
This episode of the Shiny New Object podcast is brought to you in partnership with MadFest. Whether it's live in London or streamed online to the global marketing community, you can always expect a distinctive and daring blend of fast-paced content, startup innovation pitches, and unconventional entertainment from MadFest events. You'll find me causing trouble on stage, recording live versions of this podcast, and sharing a beer with the nicest and most influential people in marketing. Check it out at www.madfestlondon.com.
So
definitely
we're
not.
at the halfway stage now. I'm going to talk about your shiny new object, which is adopting a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. So kind of sounds obvious what that is, but can you just explain to the audience why that's your shiny new object and what it is to you?
Sure. So, you know, as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of the conversation, so I've always taken an interest in kind of different facets of psychology. I was an undergrad major, almost went to grad school in that. And I've always kind of taken liking to it. So it's always been kind of a hobby of mine to explore different facets of psychology. Now, you know, there are all the traditional theories and all of that, but, you know, there are many theories kind of in more modern psychology that talk a lot about belief systems. Okay. And how belief systems about our own abilities and potential kind of fuel our behavior and predict our own success. And so that's kind of what this growth mindset versus fixed mindset is all about. And so basically a fixed mindset kind of assumes that our character, our intelligence, our creative ability are somewhat static and immutable, and that we can't change them in any meaningful way along the path of our journey. And that success is basically just an affirmation of what we inherently are born with in terms of intelligence, etc. But a growth mindset, on the other hand, basically thrives on the change and on the challenge, and sees, what I love about it is that it sees failure not as kind of an example or evidence of unintelligence, but kind of like as a springboard for growth, right? And for kind of stretching and kind of enhancing our own abilities. And so and the idea about this is that, and as with everything in life, but especially kind of with these types of, you know, philosophies of psychology, is that both of these mindsets are kind of components. First of all, we all are on a spectrum, by the way. everyone is on a spectrum, just like in other facets of our lives. And so all of us at some level have both a fixed and a growth mindset. But the idea is what you adopt in your own belief system and kind of strive to do more of, or kind of strive to kind of engage in more often. And so out of these two mindsets, which we manifest kind of from a very early age and throughout our lives, there's, based on what we kind of internalize and work on as our own belief system, it kind of springs and kind of evolves a lot of what our behavior becomes. And so our relationship with success and failure, which happens throughout our lives, definitely in our professional career, but also in our personal context, they ultimately kind of, this kind of relationship with our belief system and success and failure basically also ultimately determines how happy we are, how content we are, how fulfilled we are, again, in both the professional and the personal context. So that was a lot, but really what it is, and by the way, the best part of this and why, I've adopted this even more strongly. So I've dabbled in it and thought about this a lot throughout my life, but it's come even more to the fore as kind of my modus operandi, through the mirror of my children, by the way, because my children are about to kind of enter, wish me luck, Tom, they're all kind of in the preteen, entering teenage stage, 3 of them kind of 4 years apart. So wish me luck, I said, please. And basically, the growth mindset is something that I've seen through them. They've also been exposed to it actually in their own, in their schooling and kind of the approach that the school is taking. And I've seen that when we've sat and have conversations about their own successes and failure, I noticed how much I had regressed in this path or journey until recently, I guess. And COVID kind of, has done it for some, but it's kind of brought it to the fore. I think we have more time, even though we're working harder, I think we have a lot more time for reflection. I'm definitely spending a lot more time with my children, sometimes to a fault, to a detriment, just kidding. But it has really kind of helped me kind of look honestly at myself and how far I've digressed from that original kind of, charge that I set for myself, which is to kind of adopt much more of a growth mindset. And so through my children, I've been able to work on that a lot more and really take a closer look and see how I can really fine tune what I'm doing and how I can make sure that I really am adopting this, kind of for every part of this journey, right? Professional. And I will say it's also for personal. I think we cannot ignore that side of it. I know this is more of a podcast about the future of marketing, but I will say that when the professional and the personal are more synergistic and symbiotic, I guess, and when you're looking at the facets of your life, not piecemeal and not compartmentalized, you're not only much more effective in what you do professionally, obviously, for sure, as a marketer and a communicator, but obviously as a human being, and that allows you to grow in kind of both facets. So this is kind of a continuous journey, but this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. This is what I see as kind of my shiny new object. But
So
yeah.
So it's easy to, in some senses, talk about things like growth mindsets, and it makes so much sense. I don't think anyone's going to go, oh no, you should definitely have a fixed mindset, a growth mindset. What's the benefit of that? But there's a huge gulf between saying these things and doing these things. Now, where I struggle with a growth mindset is when I'm tired or I've got a hangover or I'm bored, and I find those things are huge blockers to like putting myself in that very kind of inspiration, excitement-led growth mindset. So what are the tools and tips and tricks that you have for keeping in a growth mindset? Because it's very easy to say it. It's very easy to start out on it. It's very easy to do it on Monday morning when you've had some rest over the weekend. But when reality hits by 11:15 on Monday, things like growth mindsets can just completely go out the window because you've got 7 spreadsheets or PowerPoints or whatever to write or arguments to have with people. So how do you keep that positivity? How would you keep that growth when reality is conspiring against it?
So first of all, great question. So, let's be honest, everyone has ebbs and flows, right? So to maintain that, just like you can't maintain that same level of intensity in your work at kind of 300, kilometers per hour, the same thing, applies to this kind of applying this positive kumbaya, this positive growth mindset approach, day in, day out. I think the way to do it, as you do when you're kind of facing, cumbersome, tedious, um, you know, uh, times in our lives, regardless if it's professional or personal, I think you need to look for those quick wins. And I think you need to kind of break it down into kind of manageable, digestible parts, right? Whatever it may be. If it's something, like you said, like the hangover, who wants to sit and work on the Excel the next morning, you know, break it up into kind of, break it up into a kind of a manageable part. And by the way, it's not even about the task at hand, right? So the day, that could be a day where you're not thinking about fixed or growth mindset at all. You're just thinking about surviving. Okay. And everyone will have those types of days. But I'm saying, in terms of adopting the mindset, I think that finding a way again to kind of to look for kind of quick wins that really kind of showcase the effort that you're putting into adopting this belief system, so that you don't constantly get discouraged, so that you don't put yourself in a funk, right? If you're in a personal in a place where you don't seem to be having any personal successes either, right? You need to look for those, small moments throughout your day where making some sort of effort that seems insurmountable will lead you to some, to perhaps open a new channel of communication with someone, or to have more positive interactions throughout the day. It doesn't need to be something monumental every day of every moment of your life. It will never be that way, right? We work, sometimes we work as a snail at a snail's pace, and sometimes, the doldrums and the conundrums of the everyday don't show us any kind of pathway to any, to any to any light at the end of the tunnel. But even on days like these, you can look for those small incremental positive changes in your day, in your work environment, in an interaction with someone, that kind of prove to you time and time again that that effort is worthwhile. If you look at your failures, right? Because a lot of this is facing the failures that you made, acknowledging those and looking them in the face, and understanding what it is that you can do. And it sounds, again, and maybe not being able to look at all of it, right, all at once, but maybe being able to look at a component of what that failure is, and understand what is within your power at that moment in time to enable you literally to learn from that to learn from that, for a component of that failure. Again, not looking necessarily at that whole big, scary, insurmountable, component, but taking it into small digestible parts, looking at small quick wins that are seemingly and finding the significance in those. Like how many times, I don't know, this happens to me all the time, where and COVID has made me a lot more conscious and aware of those tiny little I don't know if to call them wins, but those significant moments, not every day, but throughout my day, that make a difference, so to speak, right? Because you have a lot of time to spend with yourself, right? You're working crazy hours and frenetically, but I feel like a lot of people have a lot more time. They're not as distracted by, by external machinations and different kind of contextual environments and traveling and all of that. And we have to spend a lot more time with ourselves. By the way, that was incredibly challenging, but these are the times where you actually can find and look for those momentous little occasions, and those moments that actually can adapt and derive, and you can derive meaning from them. And they're small, digestible, seemingly insignificant moments that probably you would have overlooked in any sort of different context and environment and point in time, that now you have the opportunity to look at that and actually look at those moments, think about those failures, digest them, break them up into digestible parts, and work incrementally towards, learning something and adopting kind of a new change by learning from those failures. And learning from those exchanges. So that's how I would kind of, because you can't do it all at once. That's exactly part of the fixed mindset, right? You can't. It's not about proving you're smart, capable, talented, and can solve, like it's a quick fix. It's not. it's about stretching yourself to learn something new, to develop yourself kind of constantly and evolving from that.
So unfortunately, Maya, we are at the end of the podcast now. So if someone wants to get in touch with you and take this conversation further about adopting a growth mindset, or even how to say no to people when they ask them to buy you a coffee, how would you like them to get in touch with you?
So LinkedIn would be great. LinkedIn is probably the best way, most universal.
And what, very quickly before the end of the show, what makes a great LinkedIn outreach to you?
Creative storytelling. We didn't get into the storytelling piece, which I wanted to, but be creative, be authentic, and no holds bar, actually. So approach me directly and honestly, and that's how I would love to get in touch and be solicited, so to speak.
Brilliant word to finish your podcast on. Maya, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Tom. Have a good night.
Hi, just before you go, I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to write a review of the Shiny New Object podcast on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, whatever it's called these days, or whichever podcast provider you use. We're an indie podcast, so it would go a long way for us if you could just share the word and give us a bit of a support on those channels. That would just be fantastic. If you haven't got time, that's also cool. And yeah, if you could tell your colleagues about the podcast, and also, if possible, don't forget to subscribe. And I'd love to hear your feedback. If you'd like to speak on the podcast or be a guest, or you think I'm asking the wrong questions, anything, I'd be super interested to hear what you think. So please email me at tom@automatedcreative.net. That's TOM at, I'm not going to bother spelling it. Anyway, you'll work it out. Thanks so much.